Okay, so in the past few days, you've learned a lot about JavaScript, React, and generally just adding functionality and logic and all sorts of cool features to React apps that you can use in your websites. But aside from making your website work nice, we haven't talked as much about making it look nice. We haven't talked about specifically CSS since the first week, pretty early on, actually. And that's what I'm here to talk to you more about today. As a reminder, CSS stands for Cascading Styling Sheets. No one really cares about what the name stands for, but essentially, it describes how our HTML boxes look. And some of the things that we've covered or know that it can do is it can help us control the layouts of different elements on the screen. It allows us to customize the fonts, the text styles, the colors of different elements, and also the box styles and the borders as well. But there's so much more that CSS can do that we won't even be able to cover over this month, but hopefully over the course of the next 35 minutes, I can show you a little bit more to interest you to explore CSS on your own and to know that this tool is at your fingertips. One of the examples is creating idle animations. As you can see, the project's header at the top has some wave animations that are just continuing endlessly. Another thing is adding complex layouts to our websites instead of just rectangles from top to bottom. We can also add hover animations. You can't see in the GIF here, but the changes in the style of the text are happening as a cursor hovers over them. You can do this and other things, but another thing is also responsive design. What that means is depending on the size of the screen that you're opening this website in, you can change how the website looks. So if you think about it, opening a website on your computer, you have a lot more real estate and width to display things than on the phone, right? And in a lot of websites, it'll look different. Maybe the buttons might be smaller, the text might be shorter, or it just has a different layout entirely. And here we can see as this screen, this window resizes, the layout of this website changes to accommodate for that. But why does it even matter to try to make our website look nice? Isn't it enough for it to be functional, to be useful, and to have the right text and everything? Well, at the end of the day, websites are made for people to use. And so we want the user experience to be a comfortable one that mimics expected and intuitive behavior, so that when people use a website, they'll want to come back and continue having that experience. There's also the concept of external libraries out there. And you might have heard of website builders like Squarespace or WordPress. With a click of a button, it can change the styles of every element on the page immediately. So why can't we just use that and forget about writing line by line CSS? The issue is external packages, as nice as they are, also make it harder to customize. And we might find ourselves in a situation where we want to express ourselves a little differently, try to fit our website to a certain mood, or just make a little change here and there for whatever reason. And with external libraries, that can be pretty hard, not impossible, but often difficult and very limiting. And so having some knowledge of CSS can come in really handy for making things look however you want. And so with that in mind, how do we actually make good CSS? Today, I'm going to cover number of topics, as you can see on the screen here. Very briefly and only on the surface, what I'm going to talk about is just the tip of the iceberg of what CSS is capable of. But as I said earlier, hopefully this is enough to show you just its power. And to start off, I will talk about color palettes. This is not inherently like part of CSS, but colors still matter. And I'm including it here because we don't want to end up with something like this. If you come across a website like this, it's very jarring. I mean, sure, I think it doesn't look that great, and that can be subjective, but there's a couple of objective observations you can make about it that justify that. For one, the bright yellow background kind of stands out in your face and doesn't really help draw your eyes to the things on the screen that matter. And if you look at the nav bar in the middle, if you even realize it was a nav bar, the magenta text on the orange makes it very difficult to just read and tell what's going on. A general rule of thumb that might help in choosing colors is that you might want to stick to 2 or 3. Not that you can't have more, but it helps prevent colors from becoming too overwhelming or just too much at once. And another thing on colors to keep in mind is contrast. If you look on the right, we have red on green text, which is not illegible, but it's not the easiest on the eyes as well, especially if you're red-green colorblind. But if you look on the left, the white on the blue makes it easier to just read what text is on the background. I'd like to share a tool at the URL coolers.co. It's a nice little thing where you can generate a random color palette and customize each individual color, adjust it a bit, maybe the hue or the shade, and might help you pick colors for your own website a little more easily. Another thing I'll talk about is the box model. This I think was also mentioned last week, but just a refresher. Each HTML element can be represented by a box that consists of the area. The area is just basically where all the main content sits. Like in this element, it's just the text and the width of the element, and so it's just that little thing in the middle. That's surrounded by the padding and the border. Now, the padding and the border essentially make up the space around that you can still see, space around the area, that is. If you have a border of, let's say, some box and it's brown, and you have some text inside, regardless of how much padding you add to it, the entire box will be filled with the background color that you set it to. So if you set it to like green or whatever, and your padding's like humongous or tiny, the whole thing will be green. But margin, which surrounds the border, will not end up being displayed. It's just something that, well, it's the margin between different elements, but it's just something to keep some sort of spacing. And one thing I want to point out is that you might want to keep in mind the difference between margin and padding. In some cases, it might seem like they perform or they do something similar, but padding is stuff that you theoretically can see and is contained within the border, and the margin is outside and you don't ever see it. Not visible. Okay, so now let's talk about layouts. To control or customize your layout, there are 2 properties that come in most handy: display and position. Display determines how elements size and sit with and within each other. It can take on a number of different values, the most common of which is block. This is the default value for div elements, section, unnumbered lists, and more. And when you have an element that's displayed as a block, it's essentially Well, it is just a block that stretches across the width of the entire width of the parent element that contains it, which means it always sits on its own line. And this is usually useful. If we looked at this example here, imagine we have some element sitting, some dummy block sitting within text. If this dummy block was displayed as a block, then it might look something like this, where it sits on its own line and, yeah, it sits on its own line. I think often we would probably find that the dummy block spans the entire width, not just something that's small, unless you specify the width. But another type of display is inline. This is the default value for span elements or A or image. And what these look like are just things that are proportional to the text and in line with the text. If you try to customize their width or their height properties or their margins, or specifically top and bottom margins, it won't look any different. It will look like it's part of the text. I mean, you can change the background color and stuff, maybe add some border, but applying this to our previous example, it would look something like this. There's also an intermediate value between the two called inline block. And an inline block displays something inline, so it doesn't take up its own line, it stays within the text, but you can still customize it as if it were a block. You can change its width, you can change its height, and it's useful for including non-text elements within text, like this. If we gave the dummy block a different height, it will still show that, and it will affect the line that it's in, but it's still in the line. It's still in line. And then another type of display is just none. If you don't want something there, you can set the display to none, and it just won't be there. Simple as that. Now, what if you wanted to display 3 different boxes or elements, but I'll refer to them as boxes, side by side like this? There is multiple solutions on how to do this. The most modern and most versatile of which is by using something called Flexbox. You may remember this from the first week. It gets its name from attempting to flexibly contain and distribute elements inside itself. So Flexbox typically acts as like some sort of wrapper for other elements, and it's useful for distributing space in the way that you want to. In this example, if these 3 boxes were like this, the Flexbox container would be the rectangle that contains all of those. And if we look at some example code, I don't know if you can, you can see it. Okay, great. The blue and the red are blocks, presumably with the class name card, and they're contained in a box that has a light gray background. I wasn't sure if you could see it, but I guess you can. That's good. Which we assume has a class name container, and it's given the display value of flex. We can notice that each card also has a specific width, so they're both the same size, and they have their own color, and they're just placed side by side, even though their display values are block. They're not taking up their own line as they would normally outside of a Flexbox, or like in most other scenarios. If you take out the width, we saw here near the bottom, each card has a width. If you take out the width, then elements within a Flexbox will actually shrink to whatever size that it takes just to contain its content. It won't need to span the whole width of the Flexbox, as you might imagine. But you can specify the width to something else, though. If we specify the first card's width to 60%, it will then take up 60% of the width of the Flexbox, and the other card will be shrunk accordingly to fit within. But you can also use properties are specific, that are unique to flexboxes, without applying properties to the individual elements that a flexbox contains. So on this slide, we can see that each card has width of 100, and there's remaining space within the flexbox. If we use the justify content property and apply, give it the value of space between, that remaining space will just be distributed between all the elements that are in the flexbox. And there's different values that this property can take, which I'll demonstrate a little more later on, but this is one way to distribute space. One more type of display that you might come across is the grid. And so as the name suggests, it creates a grid of child elements. And it's nice for creating 2D attributes or displays of things, because you can customize the size of the rows and columns and the number of rows and columns. If we have something like this, we set the containers display to be a grid. And the way that you set the number of columns is using the grid template columns property. The number of values that you put after that essentially specifies the number of columns. And the FR unit that we see here, you can think of it as a ratio. I think it's short for fraction or something, but essentially, because we have 3 different values of 1 FR here, this grid will display as a grid of 3 columns, each column with a width, or the ratios of their widths would be 1 to 1 to 1. And if we want to modify those ratios, we can simply change the numbers that go with it. And so if we wanted a wider first and last column, we can change those numbers to 2 FR. And so the ratios of their widths would be 2 to 1 to 2. And then same idea for rows, except use the property grid template rows. If we want to have 2 rows, you can specify 2 different values for grid template rows. In this case, we have 100 pixels for the first row. So we have a height of arbitrarily, well, 100 pixels. And then the second row being twice as tall. And then this is just another example of the different ways that you can customize that. Now, aside from display, you can use position, which determines where an element sits based on other elements. The most common one is when something is positioned statically. This is a default. This is the default property value for divs, and all this means is that the element is positioned statically, as its name suggests, based on the order that it sits in the document. And that's where it will remain relative to the elements around it. If we have an example like this, where you have 2 different boxes, one on top of the other in the HTML code, they're positioned statically, and nothing happens. But let's say we want our second box to be placed a little bit lower. In this case, we can use position relative. This just changes the element's position to be relative to other elements near it or around it. And this is handy for slight modifications, like what we were hoping to achieve over here. Let's say we wanted to have the second box be placed like 10 pixels lower. If we set its position property to relative, we can then add the additional property value of top set to 10 pixels. And then the distance from the top edge that it would have been where it was static is now 10 pixels. And so it's lower. But what if you want an element to sit at the bottom of the page like this? If you have different screen, if you're on a different device, that value might be different. You might have, more stuff. The stuff in between might take more space, less space. And calculating the specific value that you need to place it relative to box one might be a hassle. It's not ideal. For this, we can use position absolute. This positions an element relative to an ancestor element, and it's useful for nav bars and sidebars. So like if box two here was some kind of footer, we can set its position to absolute and set its distance to the bottom edge to 0, and then it will just sit at the bottom of the page. If you want it to sit at the bottom of the screen, no matter where on the page your screen is, like how much you've scrolled, then we can't quite use absolute for this because otherwise we would need some kind of dynamic value for bottom, which might be a little difficult to compute. A better approach to this would be using position fixed. This might be handy for something like a nav bar. If you want it to remain at the top of your screen as you're scrolling down a page, you can do that with position fixed. And so if we have it set as fixed with a distance of 0 from the bottom and the left edge, this element would then look like, it would then sit on the bottom left of your screen, no matter how much you've scrolled. Okay, so then with that in mind, what if we try to center a div horizontally? I think some of you may run into, or you might find yourself in this situation as you're making your own websites for this class. I definitely did, and I've had my fair share of looking up how to center a div horizontally at least 10 times in like a month. But we can do this in a multitude of ways. You can use Flexbox. The justified content property can help you justify things in the center. So if you have a wrapper, a Flexbox wrapper that contains an element, that's one way to do it. Another way is using margins. I'll explain this a little later, because if you use margins to center an element, it's kind of weird because you have to specify specific values. Otherwise, it won't work as expected, like width specifically, I think. Yeah, it works kind of weird, but another way is to actually just calculate the distance that you need. This is not really that recommended, but just for the sake of introducing the calc keyword and the units VW and relatedly VH, you can calculate half of the screen, or sorry, you can calculate how much from the left of the screen you want an element to be in order to be centered by using calc, which essentially allows you to do some math within CSS. VW is essentially a unit that represents 1% of the window's width. I think it stands for viewport width. And so 100 VW would be, why is it 100? 100 VW would just be the full width of the window. And then since the width of the card is 150, you can subtract 75 pixels, so half that width, and it would be, actually, I don't know if that properly centers it, but anyways, it does math. It does math, and you can use VW and VH as units. That might come in handy. Yeah. Oh, there are also other units that might be handy. There's like EM, which represents the current font size and other things, but you can look into that if you're curious. So I want to jump into a few examples in code, but before I do that, just a refresher and also a bit of an extension on CSS selectors. As you may know, you can select different elements to apply styles to. One way you can do it is by specifying the actual tag that represents the elements, like the first example here. You can also specify them by class name, which is just the name of the class prefixed with a period, or by their IDs, which is their ID names prefixed with a hashtag. You can also specify which elements you want to apply CSS styles to based on particular attributes. So if this is equivalent to checking if an ID is hello world, but if you had some other attribute that wasn't ID, like if you're creating an image element and you add a value to source so that you have somewhere to get the image data, you could replace ID here with image and then some other value that you're checking for. But essentially, this is just another way to select elements. In addition to that, actually, I'm gonna skip that. And that too. You can use something called CSS combinators, which allows you to select elements in relation to other elements. So the two examples on the page here, with the plus sign, you can select elements that are siblings with each other. So H2 plus P like this would select all the P elements that directly follow an H2. So H2 up here, and then any P elements underneath that, that would be selected here. You can do general sibling kind of relationships with the tilde. I'm going to skip through these. These are not very commonly used, and also we don't have too much time. Okay, this is more useful stuff. Besides selecting elements specifically or applying styles to elements specifically, you can also apply styles based on, like, for example, if the mouse has hovered over an element. You ever wondered, like, if you hover over a button, what code might make it animate or look differently? This is probably an essential piece to that. This example, the :hover suffix, it's called a pseudo class. And there's a lot of other pseudo classes. I think there's like active, which means if something to do with links or form. What's one of them? You can apply one to, like, if a text field has the cursor on it, if it's in focus. I think it's focus or something. But anyways, yeah, that's something to keep in mind. Oh, yeah, focus. Okay, focus. And then something else is active. If a link is being clicked on, you might want it to look different. You can also specify a specific child element within a parent, like every fourth child that is a paragraph element or something. It's just like qualifiers in addition to whatever element that you specified that you want to apply these styles to. Skip that. I'm gonna skip that too. Okay. Oh wow, we have like 10 minutes. I just want to run through some quick examples of things I talked about because I know I breezed through a lot. So here I have 6 divs, pretty simply placed. I just have 6 of them like this. Each of them have a class name box, and I've given them unique IDs, B1 through B6. The only thing that's out of the ordinary is that I've contained 2, 3, and 4 within another div, which I've given the class name flex. Okay, and then the initial styling I've given them is just the colors and the height, or no, just colors actually. Oh, and the padding and margin. Anyways, that's just to explain what you see on the screen here. So let's start with position relative. If I wanted to move B1 up and to the right a bit, I can use this set of, oh, let me zoom in, sorry. I can use, oh, where to go? Oh. I can use this set of properties by setting its position to relative. I can then adjust it slightly, like 20 pixels from the bottom and from the left, and it'll look like that. Now, if I positioned it absolutely, then it would be 20 pixels from the bottom and the left edge of the whole page, which is why it's down here. And it's actually out of the flow of the other other elements now. So B2, box 2 is now at the top of the page. Box 1 no longer sits above it because it's not in the flow anymore. That's one of the features of positioning something with absolute. If we positioned it fixed, then it would look like that. It would look like it's in the same position no matter how far I scroll. 20 pixels from the bottom and the left edge of the screen. Pump that up. Pumping all this out. Okay. Now for Flex, Flex is capable of doing a lot. There's a lot of things you can do to customize it. So I'm just going to run through a few things, but there's going to be a link, I think, where you can jump to a cheat sheet where you can read on all the things that Flex can do. Anyways, this Flex container that I have containing boxes 2, 3, and 4, let's change that display to Flex. Okay, and then now all the boxes that are contained in it, they're shrunk to a size that contains their contents. They're no longer, they no longer take the width of the entire screen. And if we want to distribute some space, we can use justify content. Can you see? Oh, it's like down there. Justify content. Earlier, I showed you space between. It would distribute the space in between the elements within the flex box. Space around just counts the would just also add space on the ends as well. Some other ones are like flex end. It just moves everything to the end of the flex box. There's also flex start, and then there's, I think, center as well. Center like that. And then you can also align things vertically. And so if one of these, if one of these boxes had a different height, why are they all? Oh, interesting. Okay. If I align items center and then I do that. Okay. If one of these boxes had a different height, like box 2, I gave it a height of 40, which appears larger than the other ones. I can actually specify how the other elements are placed vertically. And if I align them to the center of the flex box, then it will look like they're all aligned on the center axis, like this, as opposed to something else. Yeah. Okay. There are other properties that Flex can do. I'm a little short on time, so I'll just run through however many slides I can get through. Okay. So then from there, another thing you can consider adding are transitions and animations. Transition, this property just determines, as stated, how changes in properties show up on your screen. You can specify how long a change takes. Like if you want to change the background color of something, it could be an instantaneous change, or it could be a gradual like thing that switch from like red to blue over 1 second, just to smooth things out. Skip that too. Oh, the syntax for this is like, you can specify what property you want to apply the that time span to, and the way you want it to play. So I think the default way that it plays out at transition is linear. Actually, that might be a lot of detail. I'm gonna skip through that one too. And then there's also animations. Animations kind of just allows you to switch between move from one set of styles to more sets over a period of time. And I will briefly demonstrate that as well here. So, oh, I forgot to mention margin. I'll come back to that. So if B5, box 5, has a transition value of 0.5 seconds, I didn't specify a property, so it'll just apply to everything. I don't know why it's so dark, but it says 0.5s. Oh, you can kind of see it, I guess. And then maybe I want to change the background color to red whenever I hover over it and make it expand a bit. Then when I do that, it'll look like this. And then without the transition there, it would be like instantaneous. It's something you can think about. And then with animation, the syntax for defining what are called keyframes, which are like the different sets of styles that I mentioned that you want to move through, is a little non-trivial. You might want to look up rather than have me describe it here, but it can let you do something like this and just have a animation continue infinitely. And you can specify like how long it runs. So if I want it to run over like 3.5 seconds each time, if I want to make it not linear movement. Oh, you can't really tell. Oh, you can kind of tell. So like it eases into the motion. Anyways, one thing I said I would mention earlier was centering a div horizontally with margin. It's a little weird, but it uses the keyword auto. Auto itself has a lot of different uses in CSS, depending on which property you're applying to. But for the cases of width, margin left, and margin right, it essentially uses up all the remaining space that it has available and applies it to whatever property that you're using it for. So like, if that doesn't make sense, we have this flex box here with 3 elements contained, and there's a bunch of space on the sides that we have remaining. If we apply margin right auto to box 2, then all that space is going to be used for the right margin of box 2. And so it's just going to be pushed all the way to the left, and everything else is going to be to the right of it. Now, this might be handy for something like a nav bar. If you want like the logo or some link or whatever in one corner and then other links in another side of the nav bar, this is something that might come in handy. But to center something, you can also do like setting both margin left and margin right to auto, because then that'll evenly distribute the space between the right side and the left side of an element. The only caveat with that is that you actually have to specify width, otherwise it won't do anything. But just to do that real quick for box 1, let's say our width was like 100 pixels. Margin left is auto, and then margin 0, or before applying these margins, it looks like this, right? But then if I do margin left is 0, or is auto, and the margin right is auto, then it'll look like it's in the center because the remaining space has been distributed. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the rest of the slides since we are out of time. But one more thing I will mention for responsive layouts, a nice way to see how responsive your website is if you open up the inspector, same way you would open up the console, and you go to the, oh, it might be easier if I open up on Chrome, so it's more recognizable. But if you open up the inspector, there's a button at the top left. I think it's the second one from the top left. If you click it, you'll see something like this. And at the top, there's a bunch of like little rectangles. This will essentially change the width of whatever is displaying the website. So a laptop might look something like this, a wide screen, but you can change it to something like a tablet, and it'll automatically adjust the rendering for you, and you can see what it would look like on a tablet for mobile S, whatever, a small mobile phone or something. And you can see how like originally the WebLab website has this nav bar with all the links at the top, but as it shrinks, it ends up being hidden in this hamburger icon, just so the top is not super cluttered. Yeah, so I'm going to conclude it there. If you look at the rest of the slides, there is a couple of links for some useful things that can help make CSS easier. I know there's not a lot of time to make this website that you want. And so if you really find yourself in a jiffy, you can use some libraries to help make the CSS or the styling part of your website a little easier. Apologies for the mishaps earlier. I don't have time to show you a little more how these work, but if you want to check them out on your own, they are on the slides, which can be found on the website. And yes, don't forget homework 3 is required and starts today, or you should start it today.